Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With the violence and killing in Manipur continuing and in fact also seeming to pick up, we once again but briefly look at the causes of the problem so that on that basis we can more clearly assess the steps that are necessary to tackle the crisis. I'm talking both about immediate steps that must be taken to end the violence, but also steps necessary to tackle the deep-seated causes of concern. Joining me for this critical discussion today is Professor and Head of Department of the Department of Political Science at the University of Hyderabad, Kham Khan Suan Hausing. Professor Hausing, let's start but briefly with what you believe is the background and cause of the present violence and killings in Manipur before we come to our main issue, which is how should we tackle these problems. Now, first, in an article that you recently wrote for Quint, you identified two policies closely connected with the Biren Singh government. First, attempts to sacralize tribal lands, and secondly, the declaration of considerable tribal areas as reserved forests, protected forests, and wildlife sanctuaries. Can you explain why was this so offensive to the Kuki community?
Karan, let me first of all thank you for having me on your show. I think the point that you raise and that I have flagged in my earlier article in the Queen is the fact that, you know, in terms of the sacralization project of the state and in terms of declaring certain areas within reserve forest, there are clear patterns in which the state government did not follow established procedure, under which the state is, in effect, mandated to root, any attempt to procure tribal lands through traditional institutions. And in both the case, whether it is in Kobru or whether it is in Chifu, this was not followed. That's first. And secondly, you invoke, religious sentiment of the majority in order to sacralize the tribal lands. And what is important here to be noted is in Chifu, for example, although the original stone inscription that was erected in the particular site, which become controversial, had only, 3 stone slabs in honor of the king, in honor of the then political legend, and 2 general, which was sent. Somehow, when the, Chandrakirti Memorial Park was inaugurated in October 22, somehow Tangzing, the god of the Meiteis, was implanted there. And it was seen as a kind of a surreptitious encroachment on the tribal lands, which is the surest way of snatching tribal land. And similarly, in 2022, when similar attempts was made to declare Kobru as the Laipam, that is the seat of the principal god of the Meiteis, the tribals there in Kangpokpi felt that these are clear established patterns followed by the state to use religion apart from the short-circuiting of procedural requirements that it followed in both the cases. So in that extent,
what you're saying, Professor Hausing, is that through attempts to sacralize tribal lands and through attempts to convert tribal areas into reserved forests or protected forests, what was being done by the Meitei community, i.e. the Biren Singh government, is to, in fact, surreptitiously encroach on tribal territory, and secondly, to do so without due procedure. Those are the two key points you're making, which is why these two policies were so offensive to the Kukis. Is that correct?
Yeah, certainly that's the point I raised, Karan. And let me move to the second part that you asked on the question of protected forest. I think again a clear pattern of flouting of established procedure became imminent if you look at the way in which this protected reserve forest was declared way back in 1966, when it was reviewed subsequently from 1971 to 1988. In effect, the kind of inclusion of 38 villages, which cover something like 409 square kilometers, was excluded by the assistant settlement officer, which is mandated under Section 29 of the Indian Forest Act.
Once again, let's not get lost in detail, sir. Let's not get lost in
I think we need to get, I think
the main point you're making is, once again, by declaring tribal areas forests, whether protected or reserved, it was encroachment onto tribal land, and again, it was done without due procedure. The same thing that happened when they were sacralizing land was happening when they were converting it to forest. Encroachment without due process.
Certainly, that's the point I raised, and that's precisely why the high-handedness and the lawless law enforcement of the state become apparent, because in order to somehow camouflage its integrationist policies in the tribal lands, it come out with a set of satellite imageries, which in effect was deeply problematic, because the kind of satellite imagery was within a short temporal time space, because between
I take your point. I'm stopping
you
because I'm very concerned that the detail will be befuddling for people outside Manipur. We must ensure that the whole country follows the point you're making. And I'll repeat, the main point about the sacralization of tribal lands, as well as the conversion of tribal areas into protected or reserve forests, is this was perceived by the Kukis as surreptitious encroachment onto their lands, done without due process. Therefore, the intent was wrong, and the manner in which it was carried out was wrong. That, I think, people will understand. Now, in an interview that you gave Sudha Ramachandran for The Diplomat, you made a further point. You said that the BJP government in Imphal was targeting tribals as illegal immigrants and also as poppy cultivators. In other words, it was deliberately giving them a false bad name. Again, can you explain why they did this and why it upset people?
I think this is a deliberate strategy which in effect feeds into a larger institutional ecosystem where you selectively target a particular community, oblivious to the fact that all communities in Manipur are involved in poppy cultivation at one point or the other. That's the statistics that is available with the Superintendent of Drugs and Narcotics and Border, for example, would highlight the fact that in terms of the period between 2017 and 22, the number of people who get caught in this poppy in these drug trades are variously spread across communities. The Meiteis speaking community accounting for almost 60%, whereas the Kuki and the Tsin communities accounting for around 33%. So in that sense, it is a very lopsided targeting of a particular community in order to feed into a larger institutional ecosystem where stereotyping as well as slandering of a particular community take place.
So
and on the question of illegal immigrants,
I come to illegals in a moment time, but I'm underlining something you're saying which is very important. You're accepting that the illegal poppy cultivation is happening in Manipur, but you're saying all the communities are involved. And if I understood the statistics you cited, 60% seem to be of Meitei origin, 33% are tribals. Therefore, to simply target the Kuki as poppy cultivators and ignore the fact that the drug lords, as you pointed out in your articles, are Meitei, is unfair and is also half telling the truth. That's the key point you're making.
Yeah, certainly. You see, Karan, we have to really dig deep into the kind of statistics, because statistics sometimes conceal a lot of things. And if you really look into the complex nexus of drug as well as gun trade across the Indo-Myanmar border, much of these trade and business is monopolized and controlled by the proscribed terrorist organization belonging to the valley areas, in connivance with a larger conduit of international drug as well as gun trade, and in which the Kukis in that sense are simply, cultivators of the poppy. And of course, there are also instances in which some of the Kukis are caught in some of the major drug halls. But it does not, in effect, discount the fact that the major, business is run in full conduit with the state bureaucracy, the state political leaders, a point which become apparent in Brinda Thanozam's expose in 2018, and subsequently Raghumani, the Uripok MLA, writing to the Home Minister to investigate the involvement of high-ranking cabinet minister under Biren Singh's government in a major drug haul that happened in May 2019. So in that sense, I think if you look at the larger picture, the trade and monopoly of business of drug as well as guns are controlled by some other capitalists as well, with the full connivance of this proscribed organization as well as the state.
So far, Professor Hausing, we've talked about causes and background of the present crisis from the Kuki point of view. I now want to raise with you a cause of the problem from the Meitei point of view. It's the land imbalance, as a result of which the Meiteis, who are 53, 54%.
Karan, just before you raise that, can you just go back a bit to the other important issue that you raised, that is the question of illegal immigrants. So look at, you see, the kind of narrative that is built over time is the fact that you have deep concern about massive illegal quote-unquote illegal immigrants that happens, over time since the 1980s, But what happens is that the kind of statistics, the kind of demography, in effect, does not bear out the kind of demographic change in the hill areas. And look at, for example, the decadal, growth rate of Manipur. You'll find, for example, that between 2001 and 2011, the decadal growth rate of Churachandpur is just 19.9%, whereas the state average is something like 24.49%, and the highest of which is Senapati, 241.4%. Somehow, there is a selective targeting of a particular district to which Kuki Chin community or the Kuki Zomi belongs to. That's one point. The other point that you have also got to take into account is that unlike Mizoram, for example, Manipur have very limited identification of illegal immigrants. In effect, there was this subcommittee constituted by the
I'll stop you there because these are
let me just finish, because this is important, because Karan, I think this is important because I think the larger narrative has to be busted, because there is a particular stereotyping which is going on, which is flying off the face of the statistics. Because you see,
great detail. I have other people in great detail discuss why the allegation that the Kukis are increasing in population size because of illegal immigration is a false one. We've repeated that many times with others, which is why I don't want to waste your time on that. You made the point that the decadal growth is actually a lot lower for the Kukis than it is for the state as a whole. That one simple point proves that, in fact, there is no illegal or inaccurate increase in the Kuki size of population. I take that point. Let's now come to a key concern as far as the Meiteis are concerned, because it's important that we should also put their point of view across. The Meiteis are concerned about what they call the land imbalance in the state. They are 53% of the population, but they are restricted as far as where they can acquire land to the valley, which is only 10%. The tribals, which are the Kuki and the Nagas, are 40%, but they can buy land right across the state. Now, the Meitei believe that the solution to this land imbalance is to grant them scheduled tribe status, and that was the key cause of the problem when it began on the 3rd of May. I won't at this stage go into how this land imbalance should be tackled. I'll come to that later. But I want you to accept one thing. This is also, from the Meitei point of view, a key cause and background of the problem that we're witnessing today. Would you accept?
To a certain extent, but I think this has to be nuanced, because you see, the Meiteis themselves are responsible for the demographic pressure in the valley areas, precisely because all developmental infrastructures are concentrated in the valley areas. And it is also a misnomer to keep on citing, again and again, that the valley people do not have rights of tribal ownership in the hill areas. The massive exchange of population in the aftermath of these riots demonstrate the fact that this is a myth. precisely because there are substantial settlement of the Meiteis in the hill areas through manipulation. And that is precisely the point of insecurity, because the hill people felt that through manipulations of established procedure, there are substantial settlement of the Meiteis in the hill areas. So that's one point. The second point is that if you look closely at the kind of infrastructure, look at in 1999 when the National Games was organized in Manipur, in Imphal, there was this symbolic, statement which was often not pointed out, whereby the marathon race beginning from Imphal take a U-turn around Kangwai, the epicenter of these current riots. And this is a very important symbolic statement, because it seems to the political elites in Manipur that Manipur is all about Imphal and its valley environment. And that is precisely why, if you look at the kind of preeminent institutions concentrated in the valley areas, it is bizarre, because you see, except very few couple of institutions, medical college,
so you're losing us in
or
detail.
tribal institutions,
you're losing us in detail. Please make the point.
Sure.
Professor,
I'm coming to that.
you're losing
I'm
us in detail. The audience can't follow detail that is new to them in such minute detail. Please, what's the big point you're making? Make it.
Yeah, the point that I'm making, therefore, is that because all the major, developmental infrastructures are concentrated in the valley areas, it naturally attracts massive, demographic transfer in the valley areas. And that's precisely where I think, because of the lopsided nature of development in the state, demographic pressure is a big, big concern.
Against that background, which has attempted to explain the causes of the crisis that we're seeing in Manipur, hopefully from both communities' points of view, I want to come, Professor Hausing, to the real reason we're doing this interview. It was important to explain the background briefly. We haven't explained it as briefly as I thought we would, but we really ought to now concentrate on how do we tackle the crisis which has continued for 6 weeks. I'll begin with short-term immediate measures that are necessary. After that, come to longer-term ones. To begin with, it's apparent to practically everyone that Biren Singh has lost the confidence of the Kuki people. They are 16% of the population. He's lost the confidence of his own Kuki MLAs. All 7 have said they think he's anti-Kuki. In fact, even the peace committee appointed by the Home Minister cannot function because people don't want to participate if Biren Singh is a member. In those circumstances, should one of the first immediate steps be to dismiss Biren Singh and replace him with President's rule?
Yeah, precisely. I think that is well taken, because so long as Biren Singh presides over law and order in the state, massive deployment of Central Paramilitary Force, which is more than 40,000 now, as claimed by the Chief Minister himself, does not work, because there is a constitutional anomaly created, because there is a division of labor between, the Chief Minister, who is in charge of home, and although Article 355 was, supposed to be imposed, which is never formally imposed, you have a kind of a security unified command system, which is presided over Kuldeep Singh, the security advisor to the Chief Minister. So because of this division of labor, you have possibility of confrontation, the kind of which we have seen recently in one of the major confrontation between, the Assam Rifles and the state police. So in that extent, I think that, without formally declaring Article 355 or President's rule, you still give full leeway to the Chief Minister, who is thoroughly incompetent in establishing law and order. I think unless the central government takes direct ownership of law and order, and Biren Singh is asked or tasked to manage the state of affairs in the state, we are going to have more bloody conflict and violence.
And there is in fact a precedent for a central government dismissing in a state government of the same party as the center. Indira Gandhi did that in early 1980 when she dismissed Dalbara Singh's government in Punjab and imposed President's rule because she felt that Dalbara Singh was failing to handle the situation. Mr. Modi, in that sense, must take a leaf out of Indira Gandhi's book and dismiss his own government because clearly Biren Singh has failed. Let's come to the second immediate issue. And in a sense, you touched on it a moment ago. It's the need to stop the violence. The Home Minister promised when he visited Manipur that within 15 days of his departure, the violence would end. Those 15 days were the 16th of June, but the violence is continuing and picking up. The problem is, despite a substantial army and paramilitary presence, they don't seem to be controlling the violence. The Meitei believe the army is siding with the Kukis. The Kukis believe that the Manipuri police is siding with the Meitei. How do we stop the violence? What are the immediate steps necessary to bring the killing and the rampaging and the burning of houses to an end?
I think first thing first, I think responsibility and accountability should be fixed from the top. That is, the chief minister should be dismissed. President's rule immediately imposed in order to establish a semblance of law and order. And then, as I said, until the armed Indian army is given direct control and supervision of the state of affairs, nothing is going to work. The second point is that the Arambam Tengol and the Meitei Lipun continue to launch, a mass-scaled violent attacks against the Kukis in the foothills. They must be arrested. They must be, prosecuted under relevant laws, especially Unlawful Activities Act. And I think this is imperative.
I take your point
and there is also another important point that I want to make.
Let me interrupt you. I take your point about the Meitei Lipun and the Arambai Tengor. Do we not also need to take certain equivalent steps against Kuki militants? Because also Kuki militants are clearly targeting Meitei. That continues.
I think this narrative of the Kukis targeting the Meiteis is wrong. I think, if you look at clearly the pattern of violence since May 3rd, all this conflagration happens because of the massive attacks, offensive attacks launched by all these armed militant organizations who camouflage with some frontal organizations. And the fear is, Karan, the fear is...
No, just a moment. I can't let you get away with saying it's completely wrong. I'm not trying to suggest it's equivalent and equal, but the Indian Express itself a couple of days ago front-paged concerns expressed by the military authorities about the way in which two BSF, I believe they were, jawans were killed, Yadav and Kumar. They were clearly shot by targeted, experienced shooters, and they were clearly, the police suspect, shot by snipers. So clearly there are also Kuki militants that need to be acted against. What I'm saying is, let's be balanced and say we need to act against both, because both are committing violence.
Certainly, those responsible for violence should be, dealt with under the law of the land, right? You cannot allow lawlessness, which in effect began to be the norm in Manipur by now. But you think the major offensive strikes always come from the valley, ragtag mobs, armed mobs, who in fact work as instrument of Biren Singh government. And I think this is unacceptable so long as this massive mobilization of armed militant group with full security cover by the police commando is allowed to wreak havoc on the tribal villages. Violence is not going to end.
Explain something to me. Something that has become very apparent in the last few days is that curfew is being deliberately breached, and NDTV says by hundreds, if not thousands, every single evening. On Wednesday, a Kuki state government minister's home was burnt down. On Thursday, Ranjan Singh, who's the Minister of State in Mr. Modi's government, his home was burnt down, and Mr. Ranjan Singh has gone on record to say of his own government that it has totally failed in terms of law and order. My question is simple. How do we explain this failure to enforce something as simple as curfew? Is it incompetence on the part of the army and the paramilitary? Is it disobedience? Or is it that they are not getting clear-cut orders? Which of the three?
I think you see the kind of disturbing events that we have seen, especially since Wednesday, where thousands of these armed militants under full security cover, flouted, curfew in Khamenlok, in Aigezang, in Kopibung. They move in thousands, not hundreds anymore, and this is a clear violation of curfew, which essentially means that unless the state force is fully complicit to this, it cannot allow such things to happen. And you would also see from the ground reports.
You're saying that the state force is complicit. That's
certainly. Certainly, in most of the recent strike, if you see, the pattern is that the state commander would lead on the front and allow these, 1,000 armed militants. In fact, if you look at the disturbing news, recently, ambulances state-owned ambulances are used to reinforce as well as supply ammunition to these armed militants in the strike against Khamenglok villages.
Meiteis,
And I
when
think
you
this is
say,
very, very
let's not
serious.
get lost in detail. When you say
Yeah.
the state force is complicit, which state force are you talking about? The army, the paramilitary, the Manipuri police, or all three?
It's essentially the Manipur police as well as the police commando in the state. In fact, which all the time, lead
And not
these
the army?
armed
Are you
organizations.
excluding the army?
No, I don't think so, because the role of the army is rather, fair to my mind. Although
Just a moment. You say it's fair. The Meiteis have gone on record to say that they believe the army is not being fair. They believe the army is siding with the Kukis. That's been in the papers.
There is a historical context to this, which we have to understand, Karan, because the Meiteis, many of these Mera Paibis, the torch-bearing women, had all the time been campaigning against the excesses committed by the Indian force. Which, if you look at the kind of statistic which really emerged, it's the police commando who committed much of this human right violation. And there is a particular stereotype. There is a particular stereotype about the Indian army.
Professor Hausing, it's the Kukis who've demanded that Meitei officers in the army shouldn't be posted in Manipur. So there are also concerns from the Kuki side. What I'm asking you is, let's not get lost in the detail. What do you think is going wrong that the curfew is being breached by thousands every night? Houses of ministers are being burnt practically every night. Is it that Kuldeep Singh is not giving effective orders? Is it that the people are not obeying those orders? Or is there simply confusion between the fact that you still have a chief minister, but he's not in charge of the unified command? Which of the three?
Yes, I think three things. One, as I said, this complicated division of labor in terms of, somehow a semblance of Article 355 also to be imposed, but which is not quite the case, because there is no formal pronouncement of Article 55, which essentially means that the paramilitary force continue to aid the state police in maintaining law and order, which is a kind of constitutional anomaly. And unless this is resolved, you would not have a direct control and supervision of law and order in the hands of the central paramilitary forces. Secondly, I think it is also important to underline here that the Kuki reservation about Meitei high-ranking officer posted has to be, juxtaposed from the institution that the army represents, because the concern is, in conflict scenarios, there are increasing pressure both on side of the debate that the police officers or the high-ranking military officers posted in those areas should openly side. And that is precisely one of the points why, many of these elected representatives' house are burned down, precisely because of a sense of frustration which has seeped in the minds of this frontal organization, that they have not sufficiently held and take sides with their case. So in that sense, I think, the attempt of the Kukis, the concern is legitimate. There are possibilities that some of these fallen officers...
into telling a Kuki story versus a Meitei story, and I'm desperately trying to ask you a different question. Let's not communalize our answers. I came to you because I wanted to use your knowledge to look at this in terms of solutions. Let's not keep communalizing Kuki versus Meitei. We won't go far.
Karan, can I come in? Yeah, I think it's not a question of communalizing. You see, if you really follow conflict scenarios, not just in the case of Manipur, but in other places, there are possibilities. You see, there are possibilities.
Sir, please, why is the curfew being breached? Just tell me that.
I think it's because the state is fully complicit in that. I think it is serving the agenda of the state very well, and therefore the state is not very serious about imposing law and order. And I think that precisely explains why, there is a full breach of curfew in the state.
Now, in 1947, when Hindu-Muslim riots were breaking out all over the country, Nehru, as Prime Minister, would personally step in, definitely verbally, on one or two occasions, even physically. In contrast, we've seen nothing from Mr. Modi. He's failed to visit Manipur. In fact, he hasn't said a word about the situation in Manipur over the last 6 weeks. Do we need to see immediately a greater intervention by the Prime Minister. The use of his authority, the use of his popularity, the use of the high regard in which the country holds him. Does he need to personally step in?
The deafening silence of the Prime Minister comes as a major disappointment, and it is variously interpreted as an open signal given to the state, to carry out the kind of integrationist and majoritarian drive that it does. So that's one. The second is the kind of message that also comes through is that the BJPs all the time trumped, issues of human lives with electoral concern. It looks like the BJP does not want to use the Chief Minister Biren Singh as a sacrificial lamb, who would be given that the popularity that he commands in the valley areas would possibly ensure that if he defect from the BJP and from another political party, the BJP would be swiped out in the state. I think these are clear signals that the BJP seems to be dictated not so much by the issue of citizenship, by upholding the constitutional procedures, norms, values, and principles, but it looks like electoral considerations trumped human lives as well as the provisions of the constitution, which is very, very unfortunate. And if you contrast the Prime Minister attention given to Orissa train incident, the Balasore case, in which he personally visited the Onthad zone itself and ensured that proper inquiry be conducted, rehabilitation measures should be given to the victims, who are like 200 or slightly over 200 in numbers. So in that sense, I think somehow it's a type of policy making which in effect is simply complacent with ensuring that Northeast is on the map but off the mind of Indian public media.
Okay. We've discussed the immediate steps that are necessary. There are three that you've identified. First, dismiss Biren Singh immediately, impose president's rule. Secondly, give correct and forthright orders and enforce them to ensure that the curfew is obeyed, and remove this confusion between the split of authority between Biren Singh and Kuldeep Singh. And finally, the Prime Minister must assert his authority, must intervene rather than back off because he's worried that he will lose Meitei's support. Let's now come to some of the deep-seated issues because they have to be tackled as well. And the first question is, can the problem between the Kuki and the Meitei be resolved within a united Manipur, or has the time come to accept that the Kuki demand for a separate administration now must be conceded?
I think to answer it, I think you really have to look at some of the overtures and the recent proclamation of some of these leading political as well as civil society organization in the state. If you're dealing with your fellow citizens not as fellow citizens, as agonic, what the radical Democrats like Santal Move and others would call it as agonist side, as friends, as possible friends, fellow citizens, but as enemies who are bound, who have the full intent to annihilate you. I think it is very difficult to come up with a proposition of to live within the same political roof. And that is increasingly apparent because the kind of targeting and slanderous attacks against the Kuki communities have not stopped.
What is the point you're making? Are you saying that the Kuki-Meitei problem cannot be resolved within a united Manipur and therefore the Kuki demand for separate administration must be conceded? Are you saying that?
Looks like the kind of signals that we receive in the light of this mayhem suggests that there is a complete demographic as well as a geographical separation by now, and it is difficult to live to think about or to imagine the Kukis going back to Imphal or the valley areas because they'll be hounded out, killed, and massacred if at all they ever venture to do that. And in that particular circumstance, which is an existential threat, which is looming large. But it is very difficult, if not impossible.
I'm interrupting you because clarity is needed at this moment. Are you saying that the Kuki-Meitei crisis cannot be resolved within a united Manipur? We need a separate administration for the Kukis. Say yes or no.
Looks like now, yeah, Kairan. Looks like.
What do you mean by looks like?
Because there are signals. You see, we have complete geographical as well as demographic separation now. It is difficult to imagine the Meiteis coming up to the hills, or for that matter, the Kukis going down to the valleys, because they'll be hounded and they'll be killed. It's not just possible to think about coexistence within a particular political framework now.
Let me pick up on that phrase, looks like, because looks like suggests that it's not confirmed and decided. There is still a possibility of something different happening. Now, it's no secret that prior to May the 3rd, there was virtually agreement between the Kuki and the Naga on the one hand and the Modi government on the other to create autonomous territorial councils. The Kukis have said to me repeatedly in interviews that that is now a closed chapter. It is history. But when you say looks like, are you suggesting that with proper political handling, that door can be opened again? That those autonomous territorial councils could serve the purpose for the Kukis, perhaps with a greater degree of autonomy than originally intended? Is that possibility still on the horizon?
I think that possibility is just closing in. I think it's difficult at this point to think about alternative framework within the political umbrella of Manipur state. And I think we have to be innovative in rethinking about the possibilities of structuring institutional framework which allows territorially defined groups like the Kuki-Zou. In fact, the blueprint for which had been laid by the state government itself around December 2016, when district boundaries were reorganized in ways which sharpened the overlapping of ethnic as well as territorial district boundaries. So in that sense, I think the blueprint is already there. It would take political will on the part of the central government, given that, merging of states or breaking of states is the prerogative of the center alone.
You put your finger on the problem. The merger of states or the breakup of states or the creation of a union territory from an existing state is entirely within the power and the prerogative of the central government. And it's quite possible the central government may not act, because the Meitei, which is 53 or 54% of the population, are adamantly opposed to any breakup of the state. They may accept territorial autonomous councils, but they are adamantly opposed to a breakup. So what do you do then? If the Modi government will not grant a separate state or a separate union territory, and if the Modi government says that the majority, the Meitei, don't want one, so we are staying with the majority, what then? Address yourself to that.
I think, Karan, you see, the BJP has to take a call whether it would allow this majoritarian government in the state of Manipur to totally annihilate the Kuki-Zomi groups. That's one. The second thing, it's for the BJP to also, prioritize its commitment to constitutional provisions, which in effect seeks to protect the rights of minorities, including the tribals. And this is a clear case of what, K. Santhanam in the Constituent Assembly way back in 1948 calls it absolute autocracy of the majority. Would you allow within India's federal democratic process absolute autocracy of the majority to write roughshod against tribal rights in the state? Or would you allow lawlessness as an excuse, to totally highlight a particular selected communities? I think it's for the BJP to decide whether it would side with the constitution or whether it would allow this absolute autocracy of the majority to perpetuate in Manipur.
Okay, I take your point. This is a decision that the government has to decide, and you made very clear why you think the government should agree to what the Kukis call separate administration. But we don't know what the BJP and Mr. Modi will decide. We can only assume that they will not agree to a division of the state, in which case, how do we tackle the deep-seated problems between the Kuki and the Meitei if they have to be resolved within a united Manipur? Now, in an article that you wrote for The Hindu on the 10th of May, well before the demand for separate administration was made by the Kukis, you attempted to address precisely this problem. And let's first talk about the land problem. In that article in The Hindu, you wrote, genuine recognition and substantive accommodation of territorial rights and identities is what is called for. What does that amount to?
I think that amounts to looking at the issue of lands and tribal rights not as a matter of strategic compromise of the majority. All these are substantive concerns, which is integral as well as critical to the protection and preservation of tribal lives. You cannot allow, majoritarianism to write roughshod against this substantive concern. That's one thing. The second thing is that given that Manipur, after all, is a composite state like most other Indian states, let us also be mindful of the way in which the state of Manipur integrated its peripheral tribal territories. And I think this is precisely where the narrative get lost out, as if the state of Manipur territorial boundary was fixed in time, since time immemorial. Look at, for example, Churachandpur, which is the flashpoint of this violence. It was only in 1921 that a subdivisional headquarters was established thanks to the intervention of the British government, which after the Anglo-Kuki War extended its administrative organization there. And this particular area is kept under Manipur South District.
What's the point? What's the point you're making?
This is the point. The point that I'm making is that some of these territories have institutional protection pertaining to land as well as tribal rights and identities. They have their distinctive ethnic as well as community flavors there. If you just want to dismiss them or plainly try to ignore them as if nothing is there, I think that's deeply problematic, isn't it?
Let me ask you this. On the 10th of May, as I said before, the Kuki demand for separate administration was voiced. When you wrote in The Hindu, you did seem to believe that some form of genuine recognition and substantive accommodation of territorial rights and identities could sort out the land problem within a united Manipur. Since then, have you changed your view? Do you now believe it cannot be sorted out within a united Manipur and hence separate administration is needed? It's a simple yes or no question.
Yeah, at that point of time, I thought that, there are possibilities if, the status quo ante is restored with more robust protection given to, existing institutions like Article 371C, which you might realize is a diluted form of the Scottish plan in UK.
But that was your thinking
that's
then.
That's precisely
your thinking then. What is your thinking today?
My thinking now is that in order to resolve this impasse, I think that a constitutional innovation of sorts should be in place, whereby a possibility of merging, the southern boundary of Manipur with Mizoram as a territorial council can be envisaged. And I think that possibly is the pragmatic way out now, it looks to me, because there are increasing popular support that, the Kuki-Zomi cannot live with Meiteis anymore because of existential threat to their very own survival today.
Let me point out a problem. You're talking about some sort of territorial council merging with Mizoram so that the Kuki-Zo begin to become an administrative part of Mizoram. The Nagas, who are 24% of Manipur's population, much bigger than the Kukis, have for long been demanding they want to merge with Nagaland. If that were to be granted to you, you'd have to grant something similar to the Nagas. And then Manipur would be just reduced to the Imphal Valley. I mean, is this at all feasible?
You see, Karan, I have also explored in that Hindu article, if you look at, one of the question of reorganization of state that again and again raised in the 1950s, 60s till today is the question of economic viability, right? So, or administrative viability. And in that sense, as I have pointed out, in December 2006, given that you have extensive district reorganization and there is a sharpening of ethnic as well as territorial boundaries, looks like a blueprint is in order. Secondly, in terms of economic viability, I think that, all these tribal lands have massive natural gas as well as mineral deposit. And that is precisely one of the reasons why, the greed and grievances from the valley areas come about, because they thought that until and unless this exclusive land rights is given or not broken to allow a fair share of that access to the valley areas.
You're saying that the massive gas rights that exist under Kuki land would make a separate Kuki administration economically viable. Is that what you're saying? Yes or no?
Yeah, that's one of the points. And another point that you have to also get to bear in is that, you see, this southern boundary of Manipur lies on the cusp of the Golden Triangle. And there are two strategic trading posts, one Moreh and one Behyang, which in effect is considered to be a bridgehead to the whole of Southeast Asia. To that extent, the kind of economic potentialities.
What's the point you're making?
the
How
point
would
I'm making is
justify
that
creating a separate administration?
in terms of economic viability, in terms of administrative viability, it looks like the blueprints are in order. And until and unless there is short supply of, political will, unless there is,
But hang on a second.
I see
If
there is
the
every
Kukis,
possibility.
but Professor Housing, if the Kukis, on the basis of your argument, are given a separate administration, then how do you deny it to the Nagas, who've been demanding it for equally long? And that would reduce Manipur to the Imphal Valley.
You see, one of the contention
But answer my question. Answer my question.
Yeah, I'm answering to that, but I think you have to really contextualize it, right? The problem is that despite all this grandstanding that territorial integrity is sacrosanct, it cannot be violated upon. Look at the historical, development of Manipur state. You'll find that Naga territories are well defined in as much as the Kuki-Meitei areas are well defined, and in that sense, not an inch of valley areas would be disturbed with the creation of separate administration, whether it be the Kuki-Meitei or whether it be the Nagas. So in that sense, that is the position that has been taken both by the Nagas and the Kuki-Meitei all these years. So
you're quite happy for a solution that reduces the Imphal Valley to a state of its own called Manipur. The Kuki areas merge with Mizoram, the Naga areas merge with Nagaland, which is what both tribal communities seem to be wanting, and Manipur is reduced to the Imphal Valley. You, at least personally, are happy with that?
Looks like, because you see, there is no way out, because there are existential issues which are really real and imminent now.
And therefore, as we began this conversation, you no longer believe, this is what you did believe when you wrote that Hindu article on the 10th of May, but you no longer believe it today, that the land problem can be resolved within a united Manipur. Now, there was something else you addressed in that Hindu article, and I take it, once again, you don't stand by that position, but I will put it to you nonetheless. You were in that Hindu article of the 10th of May also addressing the complete collapse of trust between the Meitei and the Kuki. That's no hidden secret. They do not trust each other at all, and that problem has got considerably worse over the last 6 weeks. Now, in the Hindu, you wrote, any attempt to secure future stability and peace must begin with the audacity to confess and confront the truth about the very nature of these riots and their principal cause. And to me, that sounded as if you were suggesting some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Let me ask you, has that suggestion also been overtaken by time?
You see, setting apart the issue of separate administration, the point that you raise is very pertinent in order to have a semblance of friendly relationship as neighbors today, because the South African model of truth and reconciliation strikes me, and that is precisely where I thought that the audacity, to confront the truth about the nature and cause of this violence have to be accepted forthright by Biren Singh himself. Biren Singh should admit the truth that he is solely responsible in presiding over
just a moment.
institutional
Truth and reconciliation, as practiced in South Africa, was not targeted on a single individual, as you seem to be targeting it on Biren Singh. It was an attempt. To get communities and people in the majority to talk to each other, to admit their mistakes, to admit and say sorry to each other, and thus reconcile. Is that
I'll come to that.
Had in mind, and is it still pertinent? Or now that you believe Manipur can't stay united, has this suggestion fallen by the wayside?
You see, that's precisely the point. I don't want to, selectively target the chief minister at this point, because he is solely responsible. But in the process of this violence, many communities as well as armed organizations are involved across the divide, right? They have to come forward and confess the truth of their culpability in the violence that they committed. And until that confession is met and a sense of reproachment is reached, I do not see that there is going to be the way out forward.
Two quick questions. When you say organizations, civil society organizations, peoples and community, I take it you're meaning both Kuki and Meitei, not just Meitei alone. There are Kuki organizations, militant groups that also have to come forward and accept that they have erred, they have made mistakes, apologize and reach out to the Meitei, just as the Meitei have to accept they've made mistakes, they've erred, apologize and reach out to the Kuki. It has to be from both sides. Would you accept that?
I do, because you see, in the course of this violence, both sides are involved. Both, in offensive as well as defensive attacks. And I think that truth has to be accepted across the divide. The second thing that I think is also important is that in our traditional customary practice of resolving conflict, what we do in 1997 when Kuki and Zomi, had a very bad a fight. In effect, the first offensive strike was launched by the Kuki, and they have the audacity to confess the truth that they are on the wrong side. And they use customary practices of confessing the truth and using that customary practices ask for forgiveness. And that is precisely why I think that Biren Singh should come first. And once he come first and admit the mistake that he committed, all communities who committed the same level of offense, should come. They should come forward.
Forgive me, let's not target Biren Singh repeatedly. Truth and reconciliation, when it works, is between communities. Not an individual politician accepting his mistakes, although that may be essential as well, but essentially truth and reconciliation is between communities. But let me ask you this. I asked you this earlier when we talked about land. You said your suggestion about the land issue and how it should be tackled, made in your article of the Hindu of the 10th of May, was overtaken. And now, in fact, you need separate administration, and that will sort out the problem. Similarly, about truth and reconciliation. Has it been overtaken by your belief that a separate administration is essential?
I do think that a separate administration is essential, and I think we have to jettison this demand. But what is important is that given that so much of bad blood has flown across the divide, I think it is important that communities and leaders should come forward, confess the truth, and ask for forgiveness. And unless this is done, I think you cannot even live peacefully as neighbors, which is difficult.
So even if the two communities were to separate, you still need truth and reconciliation so that they can live happily and peacefully as neighbors. This remains an important thing.
I think so. This is still important.
One last concern. It worked in South Africa, but they're very different people to Indians. In India, is there a danger that truth and reconciliation in practice might become truth and recrimination? Because if the opportunity is taken to point fingers at the other and not actually accept that I or my community did wrong and apologize for it, then it won't reconcile. It will simply add to the recrimination. So is there a danger that it won't work in India?
I think it works. I look at the Naga reconciliation process. Why is it that despite all the dastardly killings in the early 1990s and early 2000s, the Forum for Naga Reconciliation has been successful in instituting this semblance of truth and reconciliation, which has, considerably reduced the level of violence in that state, which otherwise was not thought to be possible at that point of time. Why not, take up this initiative across community in Manipur? I think they are sensible people who, because of fear of violence, because they cannot. Yeah.
You put your finger on it. It worked in Nagaland because of Mr. Nilikete Iralu. He was an elder statesman who took the lead. He's highly regarded and respected by all the different, at that time, warring Naga factions. And his charisma and his influence was able to bring them together. Is there a similar person in Manipur?
For now, I really do not have anyone. But Ratan Thiam, for example, could be one. But I'm yet to hear, his objective stand on this, because looks like within this echo chamber of hate, distrust, suspicion, looks like sensible citizens are silenced in the valley areas. I think some of these respected public intellectuals, very popular figures, should come out more forcefully, to call out a spade, so that they have trust as well as legitimacy of the things that they talk about. And I think Ratan Thiam could be one possible, public figure that I have in mind.
So this is a moment for public figures of both communities to step forward and accept a certain moral responsibility because of their stature. And the actor Ratan Thiam is one such person that comes to your mind. I thank you, Professor Hausing. We have discussed not just the background, but more importantly, on the basis of that background, the sort of steps that need to be taken. But I will end by repeating what I think is a dominant thought that the audience will be left with. You think that the distrust between the two communities has gone so far that it makes sense for a separate administration. What political constitutional form that takes will be obviously for the government in Delhi to decide. But you think that to try and force the Kukis and the Meitei to live within a united Manipur will not resolve the problem. A separate administration for the Kukis will be the best way of tackling the problem. For many, that is realism and an acceptance of the fact that the problem has gone so far, there's no easy solution. But for others, it will be heartrending because there are many who want to cherish the thought and the concept of united Manipur. You've clearly indicated you don't think the problem can be resolved within a united state. I thank you for the honesty with which you've put that across. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Karan, for having me on your show.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.